Well, various surviving presidents, as we record this episode, are now sitting in Congress paying their last respects to President George H.W. Bush, and obviously a great deal of his political career is being recounted. But I thought, for the sake of the gentleman's memory, that we would cover an aspect of his life that not too many people know about. Hi, everybody, I'm Bill Whittle here with Steve Green and Scott Ott. This is Your Right Angle, and this one is called Flyboy. The reason it's called Flyboy is because there's a fascinating book out by the same man who wrote Flags of Our Fathers. His name is James Bradley. And James Bradley, after writing Flags of Our Fathers, the story of what happened on Iwo Jima, decided to look into something that happened in another one of those islands called Chichijima, which is considerably closer to Japan than Iwo Jima. Here's the strategic problem with Chichijima. Like Iwo Jima, it's mountainous, so significantly more habitable than Iwo Jima. But on one of the mountains on the island of Chichijima was a transmitter, and this transmitter was essentially used by the Japanese Empire to communicate with their fleet and army elements all throughout the entire Pacific. So that transmitter on the top of the mountain on Chichijima was a prime target for U.S. Aerial attacks, and U.S. aerial attacks were made continuously. As James Bradley talks about in his book Flyboys, he covers the example of 6 individual airmen who were shot down either from Navy planes or Army bombers over Chichijima. And the short form of it is that these American prisoners were eaten by the Japanese officials on the island. They were eaten, they were cooked, their livers were removed, and they were served up in ceremonial fashion to these Japanese commanders, drank sake and did all the rest of it. One of our flyboys, one of our airmen, was used as bayonet practice in order to stiffen the morale of the garrison. They would take a prisoner, tie his hands behind his back, and paint a red circle around his heart, and then hand the bayonet to the kind of the weakest of the spirited Japanese soldiers, and told them that they can stick him with a bayonet anywhere except for inside the circle, because that would kill him quickly, and that's not the purpose. So this is what was going on Chichijima. And in Flyboys, James Bradley talks about the fate of these 6 American airmen. I think it was 6, if memory serves. And he also mentions that there was almost a 7th. And the 7th airman almost put on this island of cannibalistic Japanese torturers was a young airman by the name of George H.W. Bush, who was the youngest naval pilot in the United States Navy, signed up on his 18th birthday, and then flew his Avenger bomber on a strike on Chichijima, where he was shot down, and his other 2 crewmen were lost. He managed to get onto a small rubber raft, just offshore, by the way, not far offshore at all from Chichijima. And George H.W. Bush decided that while there's solid land here and the entire Pacific Ocean stretching all the way back to America behind me, I believe I will paddle out to sea. Here's the part of this whole story I find most interesting and relevant. When George Bush told the story as a candidate in '88 for president, after 2 terms as vice president, I recall somebody asking him about this, some reporter, and saying, what were you thinking about when you were paddling out to sea after you'd been shot down over the island? And as I recall, George H.W. Bush said, I was thinking about, the Bible. Mostly I was thinking about the Constitution. And he was mocked for this, just mocked openly. Sure you were. You were thinking about the Constitution. Well, I bet my life he was thinking about the Constitution. He was an 18-year-old boy, essentially, who's now looking at his future being terminated in no uncertain terms, one way or another. And as it turned out, George Bush did paddle out away from the island, and because he didn't go to the island, he didn't become the 7th victim of these people. He was picked up by a submarine. It's actually recorded on film. Here it is, George W. Bush, future president of the United States, soaking wet, getting on board a submarine and being brought home for his future. Steve, George Bush didn't know the details of what was going on in Chichijima, but he certainly knew what the consequences of being captured by the Japanese were. Most of the time, they would simply strafe pilots in the water or send a destroyer out and take potshots at them with rifles or whatever the case may be.
Or work or starve them to death if they were actually captured.
Or work them or starve them to death in the Burma-Thailand Railroad, and on and on and on it goes. We fail, I think, when we look back on George Bush's life, I think we fail to recognize this most incredible part of this man's character, which is just raw love of country and physical courage. I remember when George Bush was termed a wimp. He was the wimp compared to Reagan, and he lacked the vision thing and stuff. He had the vision to go and fight for his country at age 18. He was enough of a wimp to take airstrikes against this heavily defended target, ditch in the ocean, and paddle out to sea and hope things worked out. So. Do you have anything you want to say about that particular episode in the president's life and how it seems to be not something that we hear too much about in these days of his memorial services?
I do. Well, first I want to correct some of the historical record. Bill, you and I both just finished reading The Fleet at Flood Tide, and probably the best World War II history of the 44-45 campaign through the Central Pacific. And I think the best part of that book, the real lesson you get out of it, is that we didn't wake up on December 7, 1941, read about Pearl Harbor and decide, well, we're going to raise that country to the ground and invent a whole new kind of bomb to do the job. The decision to go to total war against Japan was a slow process that really began in the middle of 1944 with the horrors we saw on Saipan and the suicidal militarism that we witnessed to the Japanese defenders, their willingness to kill or force into suicide civilians and all of the rest. And then we saw this throughout the rest of the campaign going into the middle of 1945, and it was a year of realization, both in the U.S. military and in Washington, that the only way to bring this war to a successful conclusion was to drop the nuclear bomb, and we were going to need at least 2 of them to do it because of the nature of Japanese militarism in the 1930s and 40s. There was no other way to do it, and it was a slow realization. This was not racism or anything else. There was racism, but that wasn't the heart of the decision. It was Japanese suicidal militarism that forced us into it, and that is what George H.W. Bush signed up for at the age of 18. That is a remarkable thing. He knew exactly what he was swimming away from on that island, even if he didn't know exactly what the details were. That was an incredibly brave young man. Now, what I need to do is to flash forward to what I saw sometimes personally in George H.W. Bush. A classmate of mine at a high school I ended up getting kicked out of a couple of years later, Chip Walker, his distant cousin, and his dad arranged on the spring break trip that spent a few days in Washington, D.C., for us to visit the Vice President Bush in his office, in the old executive office building. And here is the Vice President of the United States taking an hour out of his day to hang out with probably 20 12 and 13-year-old boys and a couple of teachers, and he was warm and he was gracious, and you could see the steel in him. You really could. But mostly this is a guy who had been there, done that, didn't have much to prove, and if a bunch of young kids wanted to come into his office and hang out for a while, he was going to sit down and give an honest heart-to-heart chat with us. And it was an amazing experience. And afterwards, Mrs. Bush at the official residence on the Naval Observatory grounds gave us Coke and cookies. It was it was a really great trip.
Coca-Cola. It wasn't the Clinton administration.
Coca-Cola, yeah. That would have been later. And that same steel showed when he ran for president. Where was it? The College of Missouri, where Churchill gave his Iron Curtain speech.
Yeah, I don't remember.
I volunteered. I was a freshman at University of Missouri. I volunteered for the advance team to prepare for Bush's speech. He was going to give his own foreign policy speech in the exact same place where Churchill gave his in 1947, I think it was. And it was a hell of a speech. Again, I got to see the guy in person, and just the steel was there. Forget this wimp stuff. And he turned out, maybe he was a little bit of a squish on domestic policy. You know, we expect to have differences with people. I'm not going to condemn him for that. But in terms of foreign policy, he was the exact right man at the exact right time when the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union dissolved. He was almost coldly strong. He didn't want to ruffle any feathers because that could have provoked World War III, literally, as the Soviets tried to protect what was left of their empire. But had he been any weak... If we had gotten 2 terms of Jimmy Carter followed by 2 terms of Walter Mondale, you know, going from 1976 to 1992, the Cold War would probably still be going on. because we would not have stood up to them. And when the people of East Germany decided to get their freedom, Gorbachev or whoever would have rolled in the tanks and slaughtered as many civilians as it took. But the team of Reagan and Bush were the exact right people to end that Cold War. And his grace, that thing we talk about, that ineffable grace that he possessed, that is what was needed in that exact moment of November in 1989. And I firmly believe that had almost any other president been in office, either the Cold War would still be going on or we would have fought World War III in 1989.
You know, Scott, you'll often hear people on the internet talking about the Bush crime family and this and that, and you know, the horrible Bushes whose entire existence is simply to squeeze more oil money out of poor brown people and maybe harvest their organs while they're at it. Who knows? And you hear this, and I've heard it for 10, 20, 30 years now, I suppose. But George Bush was married to the same woman, the love of his life forever. Just before he died, apparently, he said he was hoping he would get a chance to see Robin, his I think it was Robin, his little girl that died very young, I think at the age of 3.
Leukemia, I think.
And who?
I think it was leukemia.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Oh, yes, you're right. And I don't know this for an absolute fact, but I'd be willing to bet a lot on the fact that of all the regrets that George Bush had over the course of his lifetime, both as director of the CIA, as vice president of the United States, president of the United States, overseeing the Gulf War, all of this stuff, tremendous responsibilities, tremendous pressures. But I'd still be willing to bet you that the one thing that George Bush regrets more than anything in the world was that his other 2 crewmen didn't get out of that Avenger on that day. I think that must have been his number one cross to bear for the rest of his life. He just was a good man. And he was mocked, you know, by people who ended up liking him very much. I know Dana Carvey was very, very fond of him, but wouldn't be prudent. And
That's great stuff.
And you're left with a guy wearing glasses as if he's kind of almost like a bloodless kind of a school principal or something. But the man had tremendous depths of courage and commitment. And these are qualities I admire very highly.
There's a portrayal of President George H.W. Bush while he was in office as sort of this elitist, this patrician New Englander, this guy who was, you know, above it all, who didn't know the prices in the grocery store and that kind of thing. But then there's the stories that you hear from people who actually knew him. And I've always thought one of the great measures of a man when he comes to power is how he treats the people that nobody notices. And there was a story that I read this week from a Secret Service member, former Secret Service member, who said when the word went out among the Secret Service that Timberwolf was down, the heartache was palpable. That they loved this man like they loved few other presidents, that, you know, all you have to do is look once at the picture of an elderly George H.W. Bush, shaved bald, because there was a little infant kid of a Secret Serviceman who had cancer and had lost all their hair. And so as a show of unity, joining in with other members of the Secret Service, George H.W. Bush had his head shaved so that he could identify with them. He's the kind of guy who would walk over to a Secret Serviceman on the golf course when his son was president of the United States and lean over and kind of conspiratorially say, just because he's president of the United States doesn't mean I'm going to let my son win. In essence, he was a regular guy. When his longtime friend and sometime staff member, James Baker, showed up during the final hours or days of his life and walked into the room, this gets to that question, Bill, of could it possibly be that he was thinking of the Bible and the Constitution while he was on a raft rowing away from Chichijima? And George H.W. Bush said to James Baker, they have nicknames for each other, he said, "Where are we going, Bake?" And James Baker said, "Hefe, we're going to heaven." And that's exactly right. That's the kind of mindset that George H.W. Bush had. By the way, it was his idea that James Baker no longer referred to him as Mr. President after he left the office. And so Baker came up with that nickname and just referred to him by the Spanish word jefe, which means chief. I totally believe that story. that he was thinking of the Bible and the Constitution. And frankly, I think most of America does as well, because when it comes down to the fundamental moments of crisis in our lives, either we have a foundation or we don't. And if we have one, we resort to it without thought. It is, as Chuck Swindoll, the pastor, once said, that there are people who read the Bible so much that they bleed Bible, that their whole life is bibline. And I think that that's exactly the kind of man that George H.W. Bush was. We may not see his like soon in politics, but that doesn't mean men like him aren't out there serving in many ways quietly without attention.
Absolutely right, and it's been my honor to meet several of them. You know, it's funny what you mentioned about the going to heaven thing. There's a line in Meet Joe Black, which is actually really quite a good movie, where Anthony Hopkins, after a life of being a father and business leader and very important fellow, is being walked by death across a bridge and off this world into the next. And he turns to death, played by Brad Pitt, and he says, "Should I be afraid?" And Brad Pitt looks at him and he says, "Not a man like you." That is basically, I think, it. Here are some pictures of celebrities that are 18 years old. Now, I don't mean this to denigrate these people. The entire purpose of these people looking as happy and as young and as much like Bambi as is possible is because people like George W. Bush went out there and flew airstrikes against Chichijima. You don't have to believe it, but it's true. And the reason I wanted to show you some of these faces is only to give you an idea of just how young that man was when he decided to strap himself into an Avenger with suicide kamikaze attacks everywhere, body parts littering the decks of aircraft carriers, flew off with the only life he had, and did not only his duty, but did his duty with high honor, I think, throughout the course of his life. This country has had good presidents and bad presidents, and you can make an argument about George Bush Sr.'s presidency, but you're going to have to go a long way to find a better man than the man that we just lost just a few days ago. And God knows we need more of him. And as Scotty said, they're out there. We just have to find them. That'll do it for this edition of Right Angle, brought to you by the paying members at BillWhittle.com. Thank you very much for joining us. We'll see you next week.